In the bowels of the Vatican, incense masked rot, and in the papal chambers, a father eyed his daughter with more than paternal pride. The year was 1492. Rome reeked, not just of sewage and sweat, but of something deeper, more insidious. The city simmered under a heavy cloak of incense and decay. The Vatican itself shimmered in gold, but behind its polished marble and towering frescoes, it was a corpse dressed in silk. Power didn't whisper here. It moaned, groaned, and screamed behind closed doors. Every priest had a mistress. Every cardinal a secret. And at the very center of this holy cesspool stood one man, Rodrigo Borgia. Before diving into these forgotten stories, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. He wasn't born into sainthood. He earned the papacy with bloodied hands and Spanish gold. He bribed, blackmailed, and seduced his way to the highest seat in Christendom. The moment the white smoke rose from the Sistine Chapel, declaring his election as Pope Alexander VI, Rome knew the devil had taken the throne, and he wore a triple-crown tiara. Alexander VI did not pretend to be pious. He laughed at virtue. He threw feasts that made orgies blush. And in a city built on sin and spectacle, he was the ringmaster of damnation. But beneath the gold and grotesque, beyond the politics and poison, was something worse, something Rome only dared whisper in its darkest corners. The bond between the Pope, his daughter, and his son. A bond that stretched beyond power. A bond that would soil the legacy of the Church forever. She was only 13 when the city first saw her, Lucrezia Borgia, daughter of the Holy Father. A girl of pale skin and golden hair, with eyes too sharp for innocence. In any other family she would have been a child. But in the house of Borgia she was a tool, a weapon, a future. Her father called her his treasure. His jewel. His light in the dark. But the way his eyes lingered on her, it was not how a father should look at a daughter. She wasn't raised with lullabies and dolls. Lucrezia was groomed like a political asset, taught to curtsy, smile, and seduce. Her future wasn't hers. It belonged to alliances, to land, to ambition. Every lesson she learned came with a price. Her voice, her will, her body. At her side, always looming, was Cesare Borgia, her older brother. Or so the world believed. Some said he was Rodrigo's nephew, others whispered something darker. The Church called him a cardinal. Rome called him a killer. Cesare was brilliant, cruel, and beautiful. He moved through corridors like a blade, silent and sharp. He wore holy robes by day and sharpened daggers by night. At 18 he was already a cardinal. At 20 he commanded armies. At 22 he ordered deaths like wine at dinner. And he adored his sister. To Rome it was obvious, too obvious. Cesare never let Lucrezia walk alone. He escorted her to mass. He watched her suitors with the eyes of a predator. He stood too close, touched too long. He gifted her silk gowns and jeweled daggers. When she laughed he smiled. When she cried he killed. Their father encouraged it. Rodrigo didn't see boundaries, only opportunity. Where the world saw taboo he saw power. The family bond was sacred, he said. Unbreakable. Above all other laws. Whispers spread like wildfire through taverns and confessionals. The Pope shares his bed with his daughter, and his son waits his turn. In a city addicted to scandal, the Borgias were pure ecstasy. Rodrigo, for all his cunning, didn't hide it. He flaunted his children like trophies. Cesare sat at his right hand. Lucrezia sat on his lap. He gave her palaces, praised her beauty in front of priests, kissed her cheeks just a moment too long. And when the city recoiled, he smiled. They were Spanish, foreign, dangerous. Rome already hated them. So Rodrigo made them unforgettable. And that made them untouchable. But beneath the scandal was something colder, something darker. The Vatican wasn't just a palace of prayer. It was a fortress of secrets. Behind every curtain was a corpse. Every smile a threat. And the Borgias didn't just survive in it, they thrived. Lucrezia was young, yes. But she wasn't blind. She saw how the men looked at her. How the women whispered. She learned early, innocence was a weapon, but only if you knew when to drop it. Cesare taught her that. Or maybe their father did. History doesn't agree. History only agrees on one thing. This family didn't play by the rules. And soon they wouldn't just bend them, they would shatter them. This wasn't a story of sin. It was a story of strategy. Of legacy. Of a holy dynasty built on incest, manipulation, and blood. But this was only the beginning. You're halfway into the scandal Rome tried to burn away, and you haven't subscribed? The history scar doesn't flinch from the dark. Be brave. Join us. The Vatican was never meant to echo with the sounds of moaning and laughter. But under Pope Alexander VI, Rome's holy palace became a stage for the obscene. Behind walls that once held the whispers of saints, there was now music, clinking goblets, silk against bare skin, and the scent of sin thick as the incense in St. Peter's. They called it the Vatican of Vice. And for good reason. The Pope, God's vicar on earth, began his nights with Mass and ended them in beds not his own. His official mistress, Venanza dei Catanii, had already borne him 4 children. But she was only the beginning. His hunger was legendary, his shame non-existent. By the time he crowned himself pontiff, Rodrigo Borgia had a rotation of women moving through the apostolic palace. Some noble, some nameless, all claimed and discarded like fine wine. He did not hide it. He celebrated it. When his new lover, the teenage Giulia Farnese, nicknamed Giulia la Bella, entered the Vatican, she did so on the arm of a bishop. Not to marry, not to confess, but to live. She moved into the palace and was gifted chambers next to the Pope's own. A girl of 16, draped in pearls, painted in Vatican frescoes as the Virgin Mary, while sharing the bed of the church's highest priest. Ambassadors from Venice and Florence wrote home in disbelief. The Pope sleeps with girls barely out of childhood. He boasts of his conquests like a king. He calls himself holy while his daughter sits on his knee and his son sharpens blades in the next room. And those children? Rodrigo gave them the world. Cesare Borgia, his bastard son, was handed the red robes of a cardinal before his 20s. Not for holiness, not for service, but for control. He never spoke of God in sermons. He never baptized a soul. But he wielded the church's power like a warlord. Gold flowed into his hands and from his hands came blood. And Lucrezia, sweet, dangerous Lucrezia, was no longer just a daughter. She was a symbol. A prize. Her father's ultimate expression of dominance. She dined beside cardinals and silks worth kingdoms. She entertained visiting nobles. She received jewels not just from suitors but from bishops. In a world of old men with tired faith, she became the church's new icon. A virgin, a temptress, a mystery. Letters from the time are filled with awe and horror. A Spanish envoy to Ferdinand II wrote, "The Pope shows no modesty. His daughter rules beside him like a consort. The son watches her too closely. Rome forgets God because the devil now serves communion." Inside the Vatican, frescoes were painted with bare breasts and lustful gods. Artists were commissioned not to glorify saints, but to glorify desire. Rooms once reserved for prayer were converted into banquet halls, dance chambers and dens of pleasure. Gold leaf lined the walls. Musicians played for orgies disguised as feasts. The Pope toasted his lovers while priests averted their eyes. He made public declarations of pride in his children, often while his hand rested on Lucrezia's shoulder. And always Cesare stood nearby, silent, watchful, seething with something no one dared name. Lucrezia's position shifted slowly then all at once. From child to companion. From ornament to object. She was no longer just the Pope's daughter. She was the living symbol of Borgia rule. To control her was to control the papacy's future. Her beauty was a weapon. Her body a battlefield. At just 14 she was betrothed to Giovanni Sforza, head of a powerful northern family. A marriage forged not in love but strategy. Her dowry was enormous. Her wedding, a Roman spectacle of gold and crimson, attended by cardinals and killers alike. But even as she walked the aisle, the whispers didn't stop. The Pope is marrying off his daughter only after growing tired of her. Cesare, it said, watched the ceremony with clenched fists. Some claimed he broke a goblet when she kissed her new husband. Others claimed he smiled. Inside the Vatican, loyalty was bought with coin and skin. Rodrigo made sure his allies were paid in indulgences and bodies. Cardinals received concubines as gifts. Bishops were granted vineyards and villas in exchange for silence. And the sins of Rome were covered with velvet and scripture. Still, the letters kept coming. From Rome to Florence. From Venice to Paris. Foreign dignitaries could barely disguise their disgust. "They make a mockery of the church," one German visitor wrote. And yet they are the church. But none of that mattered to Rodrigo. He held the keys to heaven in one hand and the leash of his enemies in the other. He named bishops who danced at his feasts. He hosted orgies in the very halls where saints once wept. And he paraded his children, his bastards, like royalty. Cesare tightened his grip on Rome's military. Lucrezia, barely out of girlhood, became a duchess. And those who dared speak against them found themselves poisoned, exiled, or forgotten. There was no repentance. No apology. Just indulgence. And power. And at the center of it all was a daughter, a father, and a noble son, all bound together by ambition, blood, and whispers that would echo long after their bones turned to dust. If this shocks you, imagine what comes next. But if you're still watching and haven't subscribed, why? Step into the shadows with us. The history scar doesn't hold back. The wedding was a spectacle of silk, scandal, and silent dread. Lucrezia Borgia, not yet 15, stood draped in white and gold before the altar, her delicate hands trembling in those of Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, a man twice her age. His family was powerful, strategically placed in northern Italy, and the match was politically perfect. But behind the pomp, behind the orchestrated union of dynasties, there was rot. The feast that followed was nothing short of obscene. Cardinals toasted with wine so dark it looked like blood. Dancers in masks twisted through the Vatican halls, and at the Pope's table, Alexander VI laughed with indulgent pride while Cesare, his son, drank in silence, his eyes fixed on the bride. And Lucrezia? She smiled with lips she hadn't yet learned to trust, the kind of smile worn by someone already playing a game she never asked to join. But then came the moment Rome had waited for, the bedding ceremony. Tradition demanded that the marriage be consummated before witnesses, sometimes publicly confirmed with linens marked in blood. It was brutal, humiliating, and expected. But Rodrigo Borgia raised his hand, his voice sharp and sudden. "My daughter," he declared, "is not for display." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The marriage was legal. But the union? Unsealed. The bedchamber door closed, without proof, without witnesses. Whispers filled the Vatican corridors before dawn. Why no consummation? Why the breach of custom? Was Giovanni unable? Or was Lucrezia untouched by design? The weeks passed and nothing changed. Giovanni was often absent. Lucrezia remained cloistered with her ladies. Cesare, still her shadow, appeared wherever she walked. And when Giovanni did visit, his discomfort was obvious. No heirs. No affection. No closeness. Less than 2 years later, Rodrigo wanted the match dissolved. The political tides had shifted. The Sforza alliance was no longer beneficial. Milan wavered in loyalty. Giovanni was now a liability. And liabilities in the Borgia world didn't last long. But how to break a marriage blessed by the Pope himself? With the oldest trick in Rome, humiliation. The annulment papers cited impotentia coniugi, the inability to consummate. Giovanni was accused of being physically unfit for marital duty. A nobleman. A warrior. Declared impotent before all of Christendom. His manhood, dismantled by ink and papal decree. Rome was stunned. Furious. Amused. Giovanni, blindsided and broken, fled the city. But he didn't go quietly. In letters to his allies and envoys he raged, they annulled it because they had her already, both the Pope and his son. What groom can touch a bride claimed by her own blood? The accusation exploded like wildfire. Pamphlets appeared overnight, coarse, woodcut prints smeared with ink and venom. They depicted Lucrezia reclining between two men, one fat and crowned, the other lean and dark-eyed, both unmistakably Alexander and Cesare. The captions were filth cloaked in poetry. "O Holy Father, who shares thy daughter's grace, shall thy son now sup where thou didst taste?" The text was damning. The art, unforgettable. Rome laughed. Rome gasped. Rome devoured every rumor like communion bread. The Vatican, predictably, denied it all. But denial was fuel, not water. The rumors thrived because they weren't official. They slithered beneath doorways, dripped from the tongues of servants, were whispered in confessions and taverns. Giovanni swore he was threatened. He told one confidant, "The Pope's son held a knife to my throat and told me to sign. I either became impotent on paper or became a corpse in the Tiber." The records support part of his claim. The annulment was signed under pressure. The witnesses were chosen by the Pope. The physician who examined Lucrezia later disappeared. And the term impotentia, rarely used without medical testimony, was approved without scrutiny. The Vatican insisted Giovanni was unfit. But Rome knew better. Because Lucrezia, they said, was never meant to be touched by another man. She was property. Sacred property. Owned by two gods, one who wore a triple crown and one who wielded a dagger. Historical documents from foreign ambassadors add weight to the scandal. The Venetian envoy described the annulment as a farce, dripping with secrets. A Florentine agent wrote, "It is said she was untouched because she had already been touched too deeply." Even enemies of the Borgias admitted they lacked proof, but proof wasn't needed. Just repetition. And that's exactly what the pamphlets provided. Each new copy retold the story with greater depravity. The Pope and his son fighting over Lucrezia. The girl herself willingly choosing one over the other. The accusations bled into every alleyway and palace hall. Some versions claimed Alexander grew jealous of Cesare. Others said Cesare had claimed her first, and the Pope, enraged, planned her first marriage to hide the shame. One pamphlet described Lucrezia as the chalice of sin, passed between father and son. It didn't matter that none of this could be verified. It didn't matter that no one dared confront the family directly. In Renaissance Rome, where art, religion, and politics blurred into spectacle, a good lie was more powerful than any truth. And the Borgias, rich, foreign, and unrepentant, were the perfect monsters. Behind Vatican walls, Lucrezia said nothing. She moved through halls like a ghost, her eyes down, her mouth closed. But her silence was not submission, it was survival. She knew that speaking would only feed the flames. So she prayed by candlelight and smiled through slander. But the rumors followed her. They always would. When the annulment was finalized, Giovanni was cast into obscurity. Lucrezia, now legally a virgin again, was ready to be remarried. Rodrigo already had a new target in mind. Naples. A prince. Another throne to conquer through lace and lineage. But Rome had made up its mind. This was no girl. This was a woman too touched, too tainted. A Borgia. And no matter how many weddings or annulments came after, she would always carry the stink of that first bedroom, the one that never closed. Thousands of eyes have opened to these hidden truths. If you've made it this far and won't subscribe, tell us why. Your comment might become part of our next episode. Lucrezia Borgia did not get to grieve. One day she was a bride, the next a virgin again, by decree, not by desire. Rome whispered. Rome stared. But no one asked her how it felt to be unmade by a signature and a scandal. And so she smiled. Always smiling. Always silent. But in the margins of her letters, her real voice began to bleed through. She wrote of headaches, of sleepless nights, of a heaviness in her chest that would not lift. She mentioned birds that sang too loudly. Priests whose sermons left her shaking. Ladies-in-waiting who looked at her as if they knew something they shouldn't. I am weary, she wrote to a childhood friend in Ferrara. And I cannot remember the last time I laughed without effort. The annulment may have cleared her name on paper, but it had stained her soul. Her father's ambitions never paused. Within weeks, Alexander VI had a new match prepared, Alfonso of Aragon, a prince of Naples. A stronger alliance, more profitable and more dangerous. The negotiations were brutal. Lucrezia was barely consulted. Naples hesitated not because of her past but because of her name. The Borgia name. The bloodline of poisoners and blasphemers. And the rumors, always the rumors. Still the match went through. To Rodrigo, Lucrezia was the perfect tool, young, beautiful, obedient, and above all his. He dressed her in pearls, gifted her estates, wrote letters declaring her purity. The Vatican rolled out gold-threaded carpets. Rome held its breath. But Lucrezia's letters changed. They turned sharp, cryptic. Do not believe what they say, she told her brother Jafar. My heart is a locked room. Even I do not hold the key. Behind palace walls, her behavior began to shift. She would weep without warning. Refuse meals. Laugh too loudly at nothing. Then go silent for days. Her ladies whispered that she spent hours staring at the garden fountain, unmoving. And always Cesare was nearby. If Rodrigo ruled with gold, Cesare ruled with fear. He was no longer just a cardinal. He had traded his robes for armor, his sermons for swords. He commanded men now. Killed men now. But when it came to Lucrezia, he was still the shadow behind the curtain. Suitors who came too close were dismissed. One was found dead in an alley. Another fled Rome claiming he'd been cursed. Cesare claimed he was protecting her, but the palace staff said otherwise. He guards her too closely, one maid confided, as if she were his to keep. He hovered over her like a jealous god. His gifts were lavish. His glances possessive. And Lucrezia, whether out of fear or something more complicated, never pushed him away. At banquets, he stood behind her chair. At mass, he knelt beside her. In the gardens, he followed a step behind, hand always near the hilt of his blade. Even the Pope began to notice. There are accounts from courtiers who say Rodrigo once joked, "She is loved too well by both her brother and her father." The laughter that followed was forced. Then, Lucrezia's next wedding was rushed. Alfonso of Aragon arrived in Rome with reluctance. He was young, handsome, and barely concealed his suspicion. But he bowed to the papal will. The ceremony was lavish. the feasts endless. But Rome could feel the tension in the air. The bride did not look at her groom. Historical analysis paints a complicated portrait of Lucrezia at this point. Was she a pawn? Yes. But also a player, growing smarter with every betrayal. Some historians argue that her silence was tactical. Others say it was trauma. The truth is likely both. She began writing poetry during this time. Short, fragmented verses scribbled in Latin and Spanish. One reads, "My skin is silk. My cage is gold. My name is not my own." Another, "He calls me treasure, but keeps me buried." One night, her chambermaid found her on the floor, holding a broken comb like a knife. She said nothing, just stared. Letters between ambassadors suggest Lucrezia attempted to flee the Vatican at least once. The attempt failed. The guards were doubled. Cesari's watch over her grew tighter. The women around her began to gossip. They saw bruises on her wrists, heard raised voices through thick doors. They weren't sure who to fear more, her father or her brother. Some even suggested Lucrezia was complicit, that she enjoyed the attention, that she wielded it like a weapon. But this is how history treats women like her. If she resisted, she was hysterical. If she endured, she was a seductress. Lucrezia couldn't win. Not in Rome. Not in stories. And yet she survived. When Alfonso was attacked one night in the streets, stabbed by masked men, left for dead, Lucrezia wept by his bedside. Cesare claimed it was political rivals. Others weren't so sure. The whispers returned. Was Cesare jealous? Had he tried to remove a rival for Lucrezia's affections? One of Alfonso's guards said it plainly. He died because he loved what his brother already claimed. Alfonso would recover. Briefly. But the damage was done. Lucrezia was no longer just a political bride. She was a woman marked by blood, trapped between two men who called her theirs, and a church that used her as a veil for its own corruption. And as Rome began to turn on the Borgias, it was Lucrezia who bore the brunt of the myth. The seductress. The sinner. The sister who shared more than secrets. But in the quiet corners of the Vatican, where her poetry was hidden and her tears ignored, Lucrezia Borgia was something far more dangerous than Rome was ready to admit. She was awake. She had seen the machinery, felt the blades, learned the rules, and soon she would start rewriting them. After the annulment, Lucrezia Borgia vanished. One day she stood at her father's side, a duchess in gold, the next she was gone, erased from the Vatican, her name unspoken in court, her chambers sealed like a tomb. No fanfare, no farewell. Only a cloaked carriage that rolled through the city at dawn and disappeared behind the stone gates of the convent of San Sisto. The Vatican claimed it was a spiritual retreat, that the Pope's daughter had chosen seclusion to cleanse her soul and pray for guidance. But Rome knew better. She entered the convent just days after the annulment was finalized. The timing was surgical, deliberate. It raised one question that echoed through palaces and taverns alike. Was Lucrezia with child? Whispers turned to certainty within hours. Servants said she'd been seen clutching her belly. One lady-in-waiting claimed she fainted during Mass. Midwives had been summoned to her quarters weeks earlier and dismissed before dawn. And now, suddenly, she was a bride unwed, hidden behind stone walls with nuns who wouldn't speak. The story wrote itself. Rome's gossips didn't care for facts, they cared for rhythm. A scandal needed cadence, and this one sang. They said the child wasn't Sforza's. That Giovanni had never touched her. That he was humiliated not by impotence but by competition. That Lucrezia's belly swelled because she had been claimed by someone within her own bloodline. They didn't need to name names. They never did. There was only one man it could be. Cesare. And that made everything darker. He visited the convent once, late at night, unannounced. The nuns described his arrival like a thunderclap. Boots echoing against wet stone. His cloak dripping rain and fury. He demanded to speak with Lucrezia alone. What passed between them remains unknown. But when he left enraged. One sister claimed she heard shouting behind the chapel walls. Another swore she saw Lucrezia weeping into her veil, her hands trembling. The next morning a physician arrived. Quiet, foreign, with no Vatican seal. He was escorted to Lucrezia's chamber and did not emerge for hours. When he finally left, he spoke to no one. And then he too disappeared. Some said he delivered the child. Others said he ended it. Rome was merciless in its theories. One pamphlet claimed the baby was born and spirited away to a distant countryside villa. Another suggested it had been stillborn and buried in the convent gardens beneath a statue of the Virgin. One story, particularly popular in the Venetian brothels, declared the child was raised in secrecy as a bastard prince, trained in poisons and papal secrets, destined to return and reclaim his blood-soaked legacy. The truth? There are no records. Only shadows. But what we do know is this. When Lucrezia returned from San Sisto 3 months later, she was thinner, quieter, and harder. Her veil stayed on longer. Her voice was lower. Her smile, once delicate, was something else entirely. Something practiced. Something unbreakable. She had buried something. Whether it was a child, a truth, or a part of herself, we will never know. And that made the myth stronger. Rome didn't need evidence. It had enough. Cesari's obsession. Rodrigo's silence. The annulment. The exile. The secret physician. The fact that none of it was ever explained. And in a city that worshipped appearance, silence was louder than screams. The propaganda machine fed the fire. Anonymous pamphlets slipped under church doors. Priests condemned unnatural unions from pulpits without naming names. Woodcuts appeared of a young mother clutching a babe wrapped in papal robes while a cloaked figure stood behind her with a dagger. Some of the most damning were etched not in print but in gossip. A maid claimed Lucrezia was heard praying for a soul I never got to hold. A stable boy swore he saw Cesare burn a bundle of bloody linens in the papal stables. A cardinal confessed, on his deathbed, that Alexander had ordered one child erased from the records because it bore the wrong name on its father's line. All of it unconfirmed. All of it unstoppable. That's how propaganda works. It doesn't need truth. It needs desire. And Rome desired this story, desperately. A daughter defiled by her own blood. A prince raised in darkness. A pope who would erase a grandchild rather than risk the Vatican's image. The scandal wasn't just gossip. It was theater. It gave the city its nightly entertainment, and the Borgia name became synonymous with the unspeakable. Lucrezia never addressed the rumors. She simply resumed her duties, poised, perfect, untouchable. She wore heavier gowns, walked with fewer attendants, and never, not once, allowed herself to be alone with Cesare in public again. But the damage was permanent. The myth became part of her skin. Even when she married again, even when she became a duchess, a patron of the arts, a mother of many, people still stared at her waist, still whispered about the child that vanished. History would chase that rumor through the centuries. It appears in letters, sermons, art. It's the part of her story that never dies because it was never confirmed. And the lack of truth made it eternal. Lucrezia knew that. Which is why she never denied it. Because in the Borgia world, denying something gives it power. But silence lets it rot. And rot was easier to survive. So she returned from the convent with her head high. The Vatican celebrated her piety. The city pretended not to notice the change. But they all saw it. Lucrezia had gone into San Sisto a pawn. She came out a player. The streets of Rome were slick with summer rain the night Alfonso of Aragon died. Lucrezia had wept when she heard the news. Her second husband, the young, soft-spoken prince from Naples, the only man she had ever dared to love, was dead. Stabbed in the spine and left in the gutter like a stray dog. No ransom. No warning. Just blood and silence and the stench of betrayal. He had been everything the others weren't. Gentle, thoughtful, kind. Where Giovanni Sforza had treated her like a political coin, Alfonso had spoken to her like she was real. His hands had trembled when he touched her, not with fear but reverence. He played music. Wrote poems. He smiled at her as though he didn't see the name Borgia stitched across her skin. And now he was gone. Murdered in the dark, in the heart of the city her family ruled. Everyone already knew who had done it. They didn't say it aloud. They didn't have to. Cesare. The name lingered on every tongue. Rome didn't speak of motives. It spoke of patterns. Cesare had removed rivals before, quietly, efficiently. Cardinals who questioned the Pope. Nobles who refused Borgia marriages. Ambassadors who failed to show the proper reverence. But this was different. Alfonso wasn't just a threat. He was a husband. He was her husband. And that meant Cesare hadn't just taken a life. He had declared ownership. Lucrezia's grief was public. She wore black. She fasted. She knelt for hours in the Vatican's private chapel, whispering prayers over a cold stone floor. But she allowed no visitors. Not even her father. Especially not her brother. For weeks, the Vatican was silent. The Pope issued no edicts. Cesare gave no denials. But the city screamed. Pamphlets poured through the alleys like spilled wine. One depicted Lucrezia cradling Alfonso's corpse while Cesare stood over them with a bloody dagger. The caption read, Cain, crowned in crimson, kills for love. The incest rumor twisted, mutated, found new breath. Before, it had been shadowy, something whispered behind closed doors. Now it had form. Now it had a corpse. Why would Cesare kill a man who posed no military threat? Why would a brother eliminate his sister's happiness? The answer was too monstrous to ignore. Jealousy. It was the kind of motive that required no proof. Only desire. Rome had always wanted the Borgias to be beasts. Cesare gave them the final piece. Witnesses claimed to have seen him confront Alfonso weeks before the murder. Their voices raised in the palace corridors. Alfonso reportedly told his guards, "He watches me as if I've taken something that was his." Another claimed Cesare was seen sharpening a knife hours before Alfonso's final walk. But Cesare was too clever to leave traces. He didn't speak of the murder until he was asked directly by a Spanish envoy. The diplomat, pale and shaking, dared to whisper the question, "Why him?" Cesare didn't blink. "He was a threat," he said. "To whom?" the envoy asked. "To my sister." No elaboration. No remorse. Just cold calculation. The words hit like a blade in the ribs. Some believed Cesare meant political danger, that Alfonso's connection to Naples was unstable, that his loyalty was wavering. But most heard something else. That he'd been too close. Too beloved. That Lucrezia's happiness itself had become a threat. Lucrezia never spoke of it. Not to her father. Not to her confessors. Not even in her private letters. But one courtier recalled seeing her in the chapel the night after Alfonso's death, kneeling before the altar, her shoulders shaking, not in grief but fury. Cesare entered moments later. He walked toward her, knelt beside her, whispered something no one could hear. She didn't turn. Didn't flinch. Then she laughed. Not joy. Not madness. Something colder. "No," she said. "You only proved what they say about us." She stood and walked away, leaving him kneeling in the candlelight, the architect of his own damnation. Outside, Rome roared. This wasn't just another Borgia scandal. This was different. It was intimate. Bloody. Biblical. The incest myth bloomed like a corpse flower. Now it had a motive. A murder. A widow. And the Vatican, silent as the grave, offered nothing in defense. Rodrigo refused to denounce his son. Cesare continued to walk the halls untouched, his boots echoing like a death knell. Lucrezia became a ghost. She rarely left her quarters. Refused to eat with the family. Refused to smile. The palace staff said her face had hardened. That she had learned, finally, that even love was a liability in the house of Borgia. One night, a servant found her burning something in the fireplace. Letters. A ribbon. A small, blood-stained handkerchief. She said nothing as the flames rose. Whatever part of her had once belonged to Alfonso, she buried it herself. From that moment forward, her silence became armor. Rome would remember Alfonso not for his crown or his bloodline, but for how he died, murdered for daring to love a woman already claimed. And Lucrezia? She would carry the legend like a shroud. The girl who seduced her brother. The sister who sparked a murder. The woman who could never be loved without blood on her hands. No truth could save her now, because the story was too perfect. And stories, unlike people, don't die. Power doesn't die quietly. It screams, claws, and curses its way into the grave. On a sweltering August evening in 1503, Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, sat down for what would be his final feast. The air was thick with the scent of roasted pheasant, ripe figs, and honeyed wine. Cardinals dined beside generals. Ambassadors laughed through gritted teeth. Beneath the gilded frescoes of a Roman villa, the church's most feared man raised his goblet, unaware that his empire was already bleeding beneath him. And then he began to shake. His face turned gray. Sweat poured from his jowls. His eyes, once smug and unblinking, darted wildly like a trapped beast. By midnight, the banquet was chaos. Rodrigo collapsed, gasping, raving about demons and fire. His servants dragged him back to the Vatican, but no prayer could stop what followed. The rumors moved faster than the fever. Poison. The very thing the Borgias had wielded like an art form had turned against them. Some said the Delaravere family had finally struck back. Others whispered it was God himself, delivering judgment on a pope who had defiled every vow. But the darkest theory came from within the walls of the Vatican itself, that the pope had been fed his own weapon, Cantarella. The slow, scentless poison perfected by Borgia apothecaries. The same that had silenced cardinals, rivals, lovers. He died over 3 days, screaming, delirious, choking on visions. One witness claimed he begged for Lucrezia. Another said he cursed her name. Daughter, forgive me. Then he was gone. The Pope of Pleasure. The Patriarch of Poison. The man who turned the Vatican into a brothel with a crown was dead. The power vacuum was instant. The papal court, once decorated with Borgia banners and Spanish coin, flipped overnight. Allies turned their cloaks. Enemies pounced. Cardinals who'd kissed his ring now spat on his name. The Vatican didn't just abandon the Borgias, it hunted them. Cesare Borgia returned from military campaign to find Rome already slipping from his grasp. His father was cold in the crypt. His enemies were warm in the conclave. He had built his career on borrowed power, and now the lender was in the grave. He unraveled. The man who had murdered with strategy and seduced with violence began to falter. He locked himself in chambers, held private councils with mercenaries, drafted orders that no one followed. His army thinned. His coffers dried. His name, once whispered with fear, became a punchline in courtly jokes. Then came the arrest. Captured in Naples by former allies, Cesare was dragged in chains across the coast. The Spanish king, once a patron, now called him a liability. He was imprisoned in Valencia. Then transferred to a cold stone tower in La Mota. Forgotten by Europe. Mocked by the church he once controlled. Lucrezia received the letter in Ferrara, where she now lived as Duchess d'Este. She didn't cry. The woman who had once been Rome's favorite scandal was now the jewel of Ferrara's court, elegant, composed, adored by the people. She hosted poets, sponsored painters, fed the hungry, prayed for hours in quiet chapels. But nothing could erase her name. Whispers followed her like shadows. At masquerades, guests wore masks shaped like daggers and halos. Street vendors sold pamphlets in secret, depicting her as a grieving widow standing between two coffins, one for a husband, the other for a brother. Even her own lady sometimes flinched when she entered the room. She tried to live as something new. A duchess. A mother. A patron of the arts. But the past doesn't fade. It festers. News of Cesari's death arrived in 1507. He had escaped prison, fled to Navarre, and died in battle, struck down not by a noble rival or a political enemy, but by a nameless soldier's spear. His body, stripped of armor, was left in a ditch. A dog was found gnawing at his hand when the locals arrived to bury him. There was no honor. No ceremony. Just an unmarked grave for a man who once believed he would crown kings. Lucrezia ordered a private mass. She lit a candle in her chapel. She whispered a name that had scorched her life. And then she closed the doors. He had loved her too fiercely. Protected her too violently. Controlled her too completely. And though history could never agree on whether their bond had crossed the line, she knew that whatever they'd shared had scarred them both. Now he was gone. Her father, dead. Her brother, dead. The power that had shaped her life, dissolved into whispers and rotting woodcuts. But Lucrezia remained. And Rome never forgave her for that. In Ferrara she raised children. Commissioned cathedrals. Endowed hospitals. She walked the line between sinner and saint, never flinching. But she was never truly free. Every time a traveling preacher spoke of women who lured men into darkness, eyes turned toward her balcony. Every time a painting of the Virgin was unveiled, someone murmured about her father's mistress being painted in the same pose. She once told a confessor, "I have learned how to smile without moving my lips." Because even as a duchess, even as a mother, even as a woman of peace, she would always be Lucrezia Borgia. A name stitched into legend. A face forever paired with incest, poison, and papal blasphemy. They had tried to make her a pawn. Then a bride. Then a whore. Then a queen. But in the end she was something far more dangerous. A survivor. The Borgia era was over. But the curse lingered. And Lucrezia, in the marble halls of Ferrara, heard its echo every time she looked in the mirror. Their enemies erased them. But you watched. You heard. You remember. Hit subscribe and give voice to the stories the church tried to silence. In Ferrara the air smelled different. Not of blood or incense, but of orange blossoms and damp stone. The Vatican's shadows did not reach this far north, but the whispers did. Lucrezia Borgia, now the Duchess of Ferrara, walked palace halls lined not with secrets but with art. She had exchanged the silks of scandal for the robes of motherhood. She raised children, hosted poets, built hospitals and chapels. Her name, once spoken in fear, now appeared on deeds of charity and letters of patronage. But she knew better than anyone, reputation is not erased. It only waits. Even as she knelt in Ferrara's cathedral, even as she bowed her head and offered gold to the poor, pamphlets still crept through the city like rats. Anonymous broadsheets depicting her in the arms of two men, one bald and bearded, the other lean and cruel-eyed. The father and the son. Always the same story. Always the same accusation. At a midsummer sermon in the piazza, a traveling friar raised his arms and shouted to the crowd, "Beware the scarlet ghost of Rome, the woman who bedded kings and damned her kin." He never named her. He didn't have to. The people turned their eyes to the palace balcony. Lucrezia did not respond. She never sent guards. Never wrote protests. She only returned to her chamber and closed the shutters. Then she opened her prayer book and read aloud until her voice steadied. Because she knew she would never be forgiven. Not for what she did. Not for what she didn't. But for surviving. She had outlived them all. Her father, bloated and delusional, had died choking on his own breath. Her brother, brilliant and brutal, cut down by a nameless blade. Their enemies had gotten what they wanted. An empty papal throne, a dismantled dynasty. But Lucrezia remained. And that made her dangerous. The women of Ferrara adored her. They came to her when their husbands struck them. When their sons were jailed. When they needed bread, not blessings. And she gave them both. She built convents. Repaired roads. Paid for a library that would one day house the work of Ariosto himself. The court poets praised her as the Pearl of Ferrara. The people called her La Signora Bianca, the White Lady. But the rumors never stopped. Even her good deeds were twisted. A hospice she founded was said to be where she hid illegitimate children. A garden she cultivated was mocked as a graveyard for her lovers. At night, alone in her chamber, she read the letters her father once sent her. The ink faded, the Latin sharp. "You are the key, my daughter," he had once written. Not to heaven. To history. She burned that letter in silence. Lucrezia remarried, bore children, smiled for painters. But she never let them paint her without a veil. She knew what they saw. She knew what they wanted. A sinner pretending to be a saint. Or a saint who had played the sinner too well. No one could decide which mask fit better. And she never helped them choose. Some said she confessed every week. Others claimed she stopped believing in God the day Alfonso died. She did not argue. She did not correct. She lived like a woman who understood the price of being believed was often higher than the price of being condemned. In the final years of her life, her health began to fade. Fever took her strength. Childbirth drained her body. But she moved with grace, spoke with kindness, and carried herself as though the entire world were still watching, and she intended to give them nothing. One winter evening, as snow dusted the rooftops of Ferrara, she ordered wine brought to her room. Just one goblet. She dismissed her ladies. Lit a candle. Sat by the window. The city below slept. The streets quiet. Only the wind scratching at the shutters. She raised the cup, her hands trembling slightly. And then she spoke, so quietly only the walls could hear. "To the house of Borgia," she whispered. "May its curses die with me." No tears. No prayers. Just a silence that swallowed centuries. She died soon after, in her bed, surrounded by attendants who wept for a woman they would never truly understand. Not a duchess. Not a seductress. Not a saint. But something far more human. A survivor of a family that devoured itself. Ferrara mourned her as a beloved leader. Rome pretended she had never existed. The Vatican made no comment. The Church chose erasure over redemption. But the whispers remained. And centuries later, her name still stings like a blade drawn too quickly. Lucrezia Borgia. The woman they painted as a temptress. A pawn. A daughter sold. A sister claimed. A duchess redeemed. Saint or sinner? Neither. She was something far more dangerous. A woman who refused to die on anyone's terms but her own. Centuries have passed since Lucrezia Borgia took her final breath in Ferrara. Since Cesari's blood-soaked foreign soil. Since Pope Alexander VI was lowered into a tomb so tainted by scandal, even priests refused to bless the stone. And yet, somehow their legend burns brighter than ever, its edges sharpened, its center twisted, its core untouched by fact. The incest rumor still breathes. Despite no confessions, no proof, no testimony that would pass even the lowest modern standard of evidence, it remains the beating heart of the Borgia myth. Why? Because it was never about truth. It was about power, and who gets to hold it. In Renaissance Europe, men broke commandments daily and were canonized for it. Kings murdered brothers. Popes waged wars. Priests kept concubines. But when a woman gained power, especially beauty, charm, or influence beyond the bedroom, the world needed a reason. Lucrezia wasn't just powerful. She was unreadable. She didn't defend herself. She didn't crumble. She survived. And that made her dangerous. So the world gave her a story. She seduced her father. She slept with her brother. She birthed a child in secret. And when there wasn't evidence, they called it mystery. When there wasn't testimony, they called it silence. The incest rumor survives not because it's factual, but because it's perfect. It's primal. Taboos don't require citation. They bypass logic, press deep into the gut, and fester. A pope betting his daughter and his son jealously killing her lovers? Is the kind of story that tells itself. The church's greatest hypocrite. A family so drunk on power they lost the meaning of blood. A woman so desirable, even her own kin couldn't resist. These aren't facts. They're fantasies. But fantasies designed to punish. And beneath it all lies the oldest tool in the arsenal of empire: weaponized shame. Sexuality, especially female sexuality, has long been twisted into a narrative of control. Lucrezia was beautiful, so she had to be dangerous. She was silent, so she had to be guilty. She was intelligent, so she had to be manipulative. The truth? She was none of these things completely. She was all of them in fragments. A product of her time. A survivor in a world where survival for women came at the cost of reputation. History has always demanded that women be saints or sluts. Lucrezia refused both. And so they wrote her down as the latter, dressed her in velvet, draped her across pamphlets, and damned her with nods and winks. Even today the myth outpaces the evidence. Search her name and you'll find clickbait titles. The Pope's daughter who slept with her brother? Was Lucrezia Borgia the original femme fatale? Historians plead for nuance, but algorithms crave scandal. Books get ignored. Memes get shared. And it's not just the Borgias. This is the same instinct that paints Marie Antoinette as vain and callous, Cleopatra as a seductress rather than a strategist, and Bullen as a witch instead of a pawn caught between thrones. Women in power are never allowed complexity. Only caricature. The same church that birthed the Borgia scandal now pretends they were never real. Rome rarely speaks of Alexander VI. His tomb, once magnificent, was desecrated. His legacy drowned in poison and dust. No pope has taken the name Alexander VII since. As for Cesare, he remains a romantic villain. A character in operas, novels, even video games. Ruthless, magnetic, dangerous. People love him when he's fictional. They fear him when he's historical. And Lucrezia? She's stuck somewhere in between. The virgin and the whore. The duchess and the devil's daughter. The victim and the venom. Each generation rewrites her based on what it fears, or desires, most. In the age of streaming and shorts, her name still sells. Her image still circulates. Because nothing sells like scandal. And nothing scandalizes like incest, power, and religion tangled in one. But if you strip away the myth, what's left? A teenage girl married to men twice her age. A sister forced into diplomatic games she never designed. A woman whose silence became armor, and whose grief was mined for gossip. A survivor, yes, but also a human being crushed beneath the weight of everyone else's stories. That's the tragedy. Because the real sin of the Borgias wasn't their greed or their lust or even their cruelty. Rome had seen worse. The Medici bathed in blood. The Sforzas had skeletons in every cellar. Corruption was common. Hypocrisy expected. No, their sin was something else. They didn't pretend. Rodrigo Borgia never feigned humility. He kept mistresses openly. He bragged about his bastards. He celebrated Cesare like a prince and Lucrezia like a queen. He didn't hide behind sermons. He laughed in the face of judgment. He turned the Vatican into a court of earthly pleasures and dared anyone to challenge him. Cesare didn't mask his ambition in robes. He threw off the cloth and picked up the sword. He didn't apologize for becoming what others only dreamed of being. He declared it. Won it. Paid for it. And Lucrezia? She survived. Without confession. Without apology. Without dying when they wanted her to. And that is why their story never died. Because they refused to play the game. They refused to bow to hypocrisy. They refused to pretend. And in a world built on lies, that made them unforgettable. So remember this. When the pamphlets speak louder than the prayers. When the fiction erases the facts. When the woman becomes the warning. You are not hearing history. You are hearing fear. Their greatest sin wasn't incest. It was refusing to play pretend. If you made it this far, you're not just watching history, you're reclaiming it. So like, share and subscribe to the History Scar. Because we don't just tell stories, they won't let us forget.